Center for Knowledge Sovereignty is more than a decade-old, independent, non-partisan public policy think.
Crimea. The present campaign started on February 24.
Engage this, but it's a very potent weapon. But one factor here is that a strategic.
Welcome our viewers on social media as well. Our social media channels are viewed by lakhs of people across the world. Today, in our fourth talk, we are honored to have a very highly acclaimed and decorated veteran, Air Marshal D Choudhary, PVSM, AVSM, VM, and VSM. Center for Knowledge Sovereignty is more than a decade-old, independent, non-partisan public policy think tank that works to ensure knowledge sovereignty, data sovereignty, security, and sustainability in India. CKS is led by a decorated veteran, Lieutenant General Dr. D.P. Shekatkar, former DGMO and head of the Shekatkar Committee of Defense as the chairman, and Lieutenant General Venkatesh or Venki Patil, a decorated veteran and former DGMO as the vice chairman, and Mr. Vineet Goenka is the secretary of CKS. The organization engages in research and policy consulting in a broad range of fields related to data sovereignty, cyber warfare, disruptive technology, geopolitics, and strategic affairs. During the COVID lockdown over the past 2 years, CKS has organized several webinars under different themes, and one such theme is Thus Spake Generals, which was conceptualized by veteran AVM Sinha sir. The webinar series focuses on geopolitics and national security. We are honored to have several dignitaries as our speakers on various subjects during our past 2 seasons. In our first season, which was held in June and July 2021, we had 5 distinguished veterans as our guest speaker: Lieutenant General PR Shankar, Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain, Vice Admiral Sekhar Sinha, and Air Marshal SS Soman. In our season 2, which was in October and November 2021, we had 5 veterans: AVM Dr. Arjun Subramaniam, Air Marshal Anil Khosla, Lieutenant General Dipender Singh Hooda, Lieutenant General Zamiruddin Shah, and Vice Admiral Anil Chopra. In our season 3, following veterans have consented to speak, and we have already finished a session with Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain on 5th of March, Lieutenant General Rakesh Sharma spoke on 12th of March, Lieutenant General PR Shankar spoke on 19th March. Today we have with us Air Marshal D Choudhary, and which will be followed by 2 more sessions by Rear Admiral S.Y. Shrikhande and Ambassador Sajjanhar. Now let me introduce our guest speaker for today, Air Marshal D Choudhary. Air Marshal is a 3rd generation Air Force officer who got commissioned in 1983. He is a qualified fighter combat leader and was directing staff at AIF's prestigious Tactics and Air Combat Development Establishment, which is the AIF's Top Gun Pilot Tactic Training Program. With over 5,000 sorties on flying on frontline fighter aircraft, he is fully operational on MiG-21's all variants, MiG-27, MiG-29 and Su-30 fighter aircraft. In his illustrious career of 38 years, he has commanded a fighter squadron, prestigious TACDE, and 2 frontline fighter bases. He has served as the Air Defense Commander of 2 operational commands, commanded AIF's Composite Battle Response and Analysis, and was the Senior Air Staff Officer of AIF's largest operational command. He has also led 3 international exercises, the Red Flag, Desert Eagle, and Garuda. He has been extensively involved in planning and execution of air operations at strategic, operational, and tactical levels, as well as policy formulation and strategy development at the AIF level. He served in the coveted post as the Commandant of the National Defence College, New Delhi, before retiring from the Indian Air Force in December 2021. The Air Marshal is an alumnus of Royal College of Defence Studies, UK, a postgraduate in Strategy and International Security from King's College, London, a Master of Philosophy in Defence and Strategic Studies, and is currently pursuing his PhD on the subject of air power. He is a distinguished fellow and member of several think tanks, a regular speaker, and an avid writer on air power and strategy. Now I request AVM Sinha, BSM retired, moderator of the session, to take the program further. You viewers, for your information, AVM Sinha is trained on MiG-23BN and Su-30 aircraft, and during his 35 years of illustrious career held various important field and staff appointments. Post-retirement, he worked for 3 years as advisor to Bharat Electronics Limited and is now appointed as a strategic advisor of prestigious IIT Mandi. He is also an active member of our think tank. So over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, madam. For info of all, Madam Sumitra Goenka, Director Rating Infotech and CEO Triangle Global, is one of the pillar of strength of CKSM. Good evening, viewers. As we had seen in our last Saturday webinar, that Russo-Ukraine war had become inevitable due to the flawed policy and pursuits of US and its cohorts. The seed was sown by the George Bush himself in 2008 at Bucharest summit, where Georgia and Ukraine were given the lollipop of NATO's membership, and the war of Ukraine began in March 2014 with annexation of Crimea. The present campaign started on February 24. Putin's laying down the objective to denazify and demilitarization of Ukraine, and a month has passed. Since then, it has puzzled and baffled all the military strategists. And one very relevant question is being raised in the community is, where is the offensive combative air power of Russia? We'll prod this query today evening, keeping the largest perspective of air power role in future in India. Ladies and gentlemen, air power is not restricted to solely to military application of military air assets, but it is the ability of a nation to muster all its related air assets for its use in the third dimension. And in my opinion, actual and effective employment can be done by the top leadership of the country. As we saw in the Operation Ganga, students and civilians were ferried in from war-torn Ukraine. Air power has often been misunderstood even by the military strategists, since employment of its combative power, which is inherently offensive in nature, in time and space, needs a good understanding of its capability principles, like mobility, rapid reaction capability, and concentration of destructive force with surprise and shock element that can demonstrate its destructive power and can dominate the war scenario. USA failed its strategic bombing employment in Vietnam, dominated through it in Gulf War. Another misconception about the employment of air power is its escalatory nature. But this was blown off by our political leadership when an airstrike was permitted well inside the sovereign territory of a nuclear-armed neighbor to send a firm, coercive political message. Ladies and gentlemen, and to see and to understand the more nuances, to see and understand various facets and dimensions that can be employed by India in future respect to air power, I call upon my friend and exponent of air power, the Cobra leader and ex-NDC commandant, Air Marshal D Choudhary. Over to you.
Thank you, Pranay. At the outset, I would like to thank Shri Vinod Goenka, Srimati Sumitra Goenka, all the distinguished members of CKS, and all the participants present this afternoon. The topic is a long one. It covers a lot of ground, and I personally feel with enough being talked about Ukraine, and there are a plethora of speakers and specialists who are given a vast perspective on analysis of the Russo-Ukraine war. There are critical lessons which emerge from this war, and which are especially relevant to India. So the topic today is role of air power in India's future and lessons from Ukraine. I'll cover the talk under the following heads: some opening thoughts, then air power, some enduring truths and shibboleths which do need change, Indian legacy of air power usage, air power leveraging, the new normals which are coming, which have already come to the fore today and which will play a huge role in the future, and the Russo-Ukrainian war, where I'll carry out a brief analysis and finally summarize it with lessons for India. A few opening quotes. Air power is the most difficult of all forms of military force to measure or even express in precise terms, said by Winston Churchill way back in World War II. And more contemporary quote, Indian Air Force is the only military institution exclusively devoted to military operations in the aerospace continuum for national defense, as well as for protecting our national interests, which are expanding with growth of economy and expansion of trade and commercial, where they can be best or only be pursued through the aerospace continuum by late Air Commodore Jasjit Singh, the doyen of Indian air power, and presciently spoken in the year 2007. Some opening thoughts. A manned flight itself is 119 years old, goes back way to the Wright brothers. And its first offensive use itself was in the Italo-Turkish War in 1911, which makes offensive use of air power 111 years old. Indian Air Force, interestingly, is 90 this year and is formed under Clause 4 of the Annual Army and Air Force Bill in 1932 as an independent service. And the IF's offensive use experience has been for over 85 years, beginning in Waziristan way back in 1937. It has actively participated in all wars and operations, but yet, and this is a statement which I'm putting across, which might seem controversial to people, but I would love to debate on this, is that air power is still not fully understood or leveraged in the Indian context. With that, now let's get back into air power and some of the shibboleths and enduring truths. It's a misunderstood domain. The problem is being invisible. Most people tend to ignore it. Most military strategists find it difficult to understand and explain air power. But it has, air has physical attributes. And if you all remember our geography and physics lessons, air is compressible, it has physical characteristics. But more importantly, from a national perspective, it occupies sovereign airspace and has clearly defined boundaries. But most importantly, it pervades all other domains. It is a missing power from the perspective that it tends to be left out in the narrative of the ownership approach of the continental and maritime domains due to a surface-centric national security mindset. Again, some might find it a little controversial statement, but we will examine it together and then we can debate this in the end in the Q&A session. One very important enduring truth is control of air, and it is the vital military advantage of owning the skies. It enables freedom of exploiting the third dimension over the enemy's territory offensively and own airspace exploited defensively without any interference from the adversary's air power. This becomes a critical aspect and will be discussed some more in detail as we progress with the presentation. But there are some important caveats here, that the skies inherently are difficult to own, especially if the adversary has strong air force. And this is extremely relevant in our context because our adversaries both have strong air forces. The quantum of enemy air opposition, whether it's a weaker air force, a pure air force, or a stronger one, decides the degree and the spectrum of control over the airspace volume which we can establish. So the control of sky has different several degrees of ownership or has a spectrum of control. The most highest is air supremacy when you own the airspace, air superiority where you can carry out operations with minimal interference of the adversary. Favorable air situation is for a certain defined airspace and could be also for a limited period. And air dominance is found a term which is found relevance in the Gulf War, where airspace can be dominated using the no-fly zone. But finally, I will like to state here that integral to military strategy of all leading powers, that is air power. However, in the Indian military context, it is seen as that is the control of air, is seen as an IF requirement and not as a military strategy requirement. This is a very important nuance I would like to highlight here. Continuing with some of the truths. First, this bit was already brought out by AVM Sinha. very aptly when he said that air power is no longer escalatory, and the past employment of Air Force invariably meant ratcheting up the scale of conflict in the escalatory ladder, and it is no longer true today. And India itself has established this. Air power, whether it is tactical or strategic, there's been debate which is going on, but it has firmly established its strategic credentials way back internationally, because it produces effects and outcomes across the strategic, operational, and tactical realms with precision standoff targeting and limiting collateral damage without crossing borders or placing boots on ground, and ensuring escalatory control. In fact, its coercive capability has been regularly leveraged world over for strategic outcomes. The US, Israel, Russia, UK, and even China has done this very, very effectively. A little more about this later. It is internationally accepted first responder simply because the long preparatory timelines for the surface forces to mobilize and act often gives away the intent and allows the adversary preparation time or advance warning. Whereas air power responds swiftly with speed, agility, reach, and response. It has the ability to act well inside the decision cycle of the adversary and provides a vital asymmetric advantage of acting before he can react. In effect, while it responds first, it also buys time for the surface forces to come into action. The binary approach of the past, which was the boots on ground approach, it is still relevant today. But we find in the recent years, large attrition of surface forces no longer seem to be acceptable to most countries. May not necessarily be true in the Russian context, but that is a different perspective altogether. But most countries, we have found in the wars over the years, have increasingly been averse to body bags. Air power certainly cannot capture territory, but most certainly can reduce losses of surface forces by causing attrition to the enemy's military power before we commit our own. And the world over, major powers have increasingly been used in a variety of types and levels of conflict while reducing the footprint of the surface to the minimum. This has been very evident in the recent conflicts, which we have seen in the last 5 odd years. Then comes the issue of aerospace power. This transformation from air power has been due to a technology-aided fusion of air and space continuum, not only from the aerospace defense applications, but also due to a vast array of ever increasingly space-dependent capabilities which air power uses. That is navigation, imagery, surveillance, penetration capabilities in highly contested battle spaces, all types of targeting, computer survival needs, meteorology, communication, cyber, command and control are today increasingly using the airspace and the near space and satellites extensively for this. Hence, the transition or the use of the word aerospace power increasingly is buying more and more traction. One important aspect is the issue of air defense and offensive air power, often considered in separate silos, but they are inseparable twins, both integral and very integral to counter surface force operations. In the Indian context, air defense, which was the primary duty as per the Union War Book of the Air Force, but what has happened is air defense has been seen as the only responsibility of the air power, and support to the surface forces as the other option, role. But this is not so. And this will emerge. We'll discuss some more during the continuation of our talks. But the point I'm trying to make here, that air defense and offensive air power are actually really Siamese twins. You know, they're joined at the hips, and one cannot be used without the other. So air power today is a strategic power which provides kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities across all spectrums of the comprehensive national power. It is capable of producing a spectrum of military and non-military options independently as a service and jointly with others. Okay, a quick history run through. I will not spend too much of time on it. It was extensively army cooperation over 24,000 sorties, vast amount of interdiction, close support. Kashmir War, air power application led to strategic outcomes of Srinagar, Leh and Poonch airlifts. The valley was saved with the flying in of the first Sikh, when within hours of the signing of the accession, fighter strikes helped save which is not known very well, but fighter strikes helped save the day in Srinagar, Badgam, Patan, Baramulla, Uri. But interestingly, air power, Indian air power, was restrained by the British leadership post World War II and post independence. But it sort of put restrictions on the airlift and a cordon sanitaire, which was proposed, so that air injection could be carried out freely. But this restriction was not permitted, despite being pushed through by the then defense minister. But it was not permitted by the British, and possibly led to the loss of Skardu and Gilgit airfields, which are today's has had strategic outcomes. But on the whole, there was a good political-military understanding and employment of air power. In '62, we had extensive air maintenance and logistics operations with very limited transport and helicopter capability existing then. The Chinese air threat was, however, grossly overestimated. And despite significant offensive capability, readiness, and deployment of the Air Force combat units, air power was not used. There was a relatively, compared to Kashmir War, there was poor political-military understanding of air power, and IAF was not included in the high table of discussions, and it was kept out of all military planning. '65 was a redemption of the ghosts of the defeat of 1962, three-phase war in which air power was used in the last two phases, but initially restricted from attacking PAF bases, which we paid the price for. China threat kept significant assets tied up in the east that led to a lesser number of assets to fight the fairly modern Pakistani Air Force. The fear of bombing of cities, which was there in 1962 amongst the political leadership, persisted through 1965, and IAF was again kept out of the loop and brought into the war later. There was no joint planning and practically non-existent joint operational mechanisms. Disjointed army operations, where the army fought the army and the Air Force fought the Air Force. An inadequate political-military understanding of air power. '71 was a different story. It was a two-front war, the benchmark. It is today a benchmark of military intervention for political outcomes. There were clear political directions, joint military strategy, operational planning, excellent inter-service cooperation. From an air power perspective, there's full-fledged air power without any restrictions. In fact, it is the only war where the IAF has fought without any restrictions at all. A total air superiority was obtained in the east, and tactical air superiority was obtained in the west, actually, for up to a distance of about 100 kilometers from the border. Extensive roles supported with the other services, and on occasions even played a pivotal part in both defensive and offensive battles. Some of the key battles with the Meghna River crossing, Tangail Paradrop, and thwarting of three major armored thrusts at Cham, Fazilka, and Longewala remain classic examples of air power effects. Air Chief Marshal Lal's targeting system strategy. It's a very little known strategy, but it has come out in the recent studies, and it produced strategic outcomes. And it is a very undersung strategy, which I think extensive study of this will lead to a lot more a broader perspective of air power employment in '71. Kargil, the undeclared war. Air Force was brought on board late. There were clear political directions in which air power was not restricted to not crossing the line of control, in which in this battle only air defense and CSFO were undertaken as far as offensive operations were concerned, apart from extensive transport and helicopter operations. It is the only high-altitude offensive air power application of its kind at the altitudes in which the war was fought in the world over. Joint planning and execution was on the fly and happened only after commencement of the war and at a little later stage. Air power application limited to was limited to direct support of surface forces, and importantly, airspace domination of that area, which enabled unfettered surface operations. Interestingly, because Pakistani F-16s were initially operating just across from Skardu, but stayed well away from interfering with our surface operations. Important aspects is that today, that technology leveraging is very important, and IAF has continuously adopted new technology and has adapted its doctrines, strategies, concepts of operations, and combat tactics to the technology, new technology, whichever it has picked up over the period of time. In my service life itself, I remember starting from gun combat to close combat missiles to beyond visual range missiles to active and long range combat, which is prevalent in the world today. It has redefined the characteristics of air power today. In fact, the reach has become practically very important aspect. All air power assets today are in a cloud. They can go from any base to any target. Super cruise ability, air-to-air refueling has enabled transcontinental and maritime spaces can be crossed across very easily. Inherent flexibility has improved tremendously because of platform versatility. Earlier, you will appreciate we had air defense and ground attack specific platforms. Today, multi-role fighters, multi-role transport and helicopter platforms gives the flexibility to switch from roles, missions, and tasks, and a plethora of them seamlessly. Mobility. Today, we have full spectrum of airlift, which is inter and intracontinental. Obviously, therefore, it is also inter and intra-theater. And because of the heavy lift, medium, and the lightweight transport airlift capability that we have today, from the C-17s, IL-76, C-130s, and the large two-engine transport fleet of the IAF. Responsiveness. One aspect not very well known, the IAF is actually on duty, on watch 24/7 into 365 as far as air defense is concerned. AD duties in peace and war are a dedicated IAF task, and it is taken on exclusively by the Air Force in peacetime. And very few people know the large amount of scrambles and interceptions which take place of fighters, which are due to the early warning of the radars, which churn throughout the year, 24/7, 365 days in a year, and a large number of interceptions which have been carried out of unidentified tracks, aircraft which have strayed from their tracks, unidentified objects like balloons and microlights and things like that. Today, the IAF has an extended integrated air defense capability where the surface-to-air weapon systems and the air platforms are well integrated into a volume of airspace which actually extends across into the adversarial airspace. That means our air defense can project the weapons and their capabilities into the enemy airspace. Therefore, we can actually engage the adversary in their airspace well before they come anywhere near our borders. Today, the offensive lethality has taken on unprecedented in an unprecedented manner of the past. Today, precision standoff capability of weapons, the all variety of platforms that we have, which are capable of delivering offensive air power across the spectrum of warfare. Weapon to target matching that means for every specific target system, we have dedicated weapons which can be used over the target requirements, which are all a part of offensive lethality, which actually calculates the amount of weapon requirement to engage a target system. In fact, the DMPI, the designated mean point of impact, which means exactly which point of the target system, the most vulnerable point of the target system, which is to be engaged and which the coordinates are fed into the weapons. Hypersonic weapons, transcontinental missiles, use of offensive drones, loyal wingman, the A2AD capability, and penetrative capabilities are all a part of offensive lethality, which has expanded the basket of air power, offensive air power, tremendously today. Then we have cross-spectrum capability of engaging in warfare, which ranges from ballistic missile defense to drone warfare. I will not get too much into it, but we will see along the way how air power fits into it. Strategic employment options. Today, air power is a very potent factor in non-conventional warfare. That means in the nuclear delivery of weapons. It's a part of nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence. It plays an important role in coercive deterrence. It has an interestingly plays asymmetric deterrence where air power in asymmetric usage can turn the tide of the battle in certain battle spaces. It is capable of strategic signaling, which the Chinese Air Force has been doing extensively over Taiwan, as you are all aware. And it can be used for punitive signaling, as was brought out by my friend Marshal Sinha when he explained about the strike over Jabba Top, and we crossed into an adversarial airspace to send a firm political message across. Now let's take a look at the Russo-Ukraine war. It's 1 month, 2 days, and almost all Western analysts have been extensively reporting on it. Somewhat biased, if I might add, or I would rather say, a one-sided story. And this bias, information warfare, perception shaping, false news abounds, which makes it very difficult to cut through the layers of what has actually happened. I will not waste time on the broader perspectives because a whole lot of specialists and strategic thinkers and who have aired their views on it. I will restrict myself purely to the air warfare. The air warfare between the Russian aerospace forces, or the VKS, and the Ukrainian PSU. This is where the two have engaged. The Western air war narrative has claimed that the Russian air power has been missing its action, which was also referred to the chair. The analysis from the West have laid down several aspects which have emerged, which says the inadequacy of precision-guided munitions on the VKS inventory, inability of the VKS to manage contested airspace between, that means the Ukrainian airspace, that means VKS and the air defense of the Russian army have not been able to manage their operations successfully. That means obviously a lack of coordination. Poor training standards of Russian pilots apparently has been claimed due to inadequate flying hours. Their inability to undertake large-scale offensive missions has been also been referred to. Poor Army-Air Force cooperation, I think that is pretty visible, has been addressed, I think, by all quarters. The reluctance of VKS leadership to engage in operations which highlight their capability gaps is another analysis by the West. The Ukrainian Air Force is skilled, bold, but has the narrative of a David fighting Goliath, which has also come out in many perspectives. In fact, the ghost of Ukraine, where a Ukrainian fighter pilot is supposed to have claimed 6 kills, but these are all part of the myth making. The facts are not clear as yet. And that the PSU has inflicted disproportionately large damage on the Russian Air Force. The Russian air war narratives, on the other hand, has been inadequate, very little objective analysis. More nuanced inputs are, however, slowly emerging from the initial heady days where the narrative was purely Western heavy. Interestingly, the VKS was formed in 2015, post a major restructuring where the Russian Air Force, the VVS, Air Defense, which was independent, which was the PVSM, and the Space Forces were all merged into the VKS, which was called the Russian Aerospace Forces. They have studied the Gulf War closely, and the role of air power in modern warfare having increased, needed a review and reassessment of the resource prioritization of the Army, Air Force, and the Navy in Russia. A new doctrinal approach with a focus on 9 areas were identified by the Defense Minister, Grachev, of which 7 were directly associated with air power. Very interesting. The Air Force was downsized, revived, and modernized despite the resource crunch they were going through post the breakup. General Korolkov emphasized that the VVS must gain air superiority, destroy the enemy from the air to his full operational depth, and apply principles of mass and centralized control. Now, this quote will probably come out in a greater, clearer perspective as we progress along with the analysis. So the Russian outlook of air power was best summed up by the Commander-in-Chief Pyotr Denikin when he said, "Russia without wings is not Russia. It has had does have and will have them. Their combat experience post-breakup was over the two Chechen wars in Georgia and more importantly in Syria, where tactical employment of their new tactics, and it was also the testing ground of the new weapons. Now, an independent analysis which I carried out, in fact, on 9th of November, and I put it out. This link is available. Interested participants could log on to it. Where on the 9th, after the initial analysis of 2 weeks of the war's progression was made, and interestingly, a lot of facts which were brought out there, I will cover them in detail later. Key caveats which emerged, which the West referred to, is that the Russian warfighting precepts definitely draw lessons from Western military interventions, which they have. But Russian operational ethos, the concepts of operations, their tactics, the overall strategy is significantly different from the Western concepts of operation. And that is why the West had difficulty in understanding how the Russians operate, because they weighed it from their own perspective and seen through their lens. Ukraine's military and the Air Force essentially was modeled and trained on the Russian military and the Air Force. So this is an important aspect we must bear in mind, not so much of Western training as much as which is going on right now with the NATO intervention and US aid to spin up the Ukrainian Air Force. Russian military and the Air Force historically proven willingness and ability of the Russian military to stomach and absorb losses and fight under extreme conditions of hardship. Now, this is totally contradictory to the Western precepts. And that is why when the losses were heavy, the West was very quick to write off the Russian tactics. But at the end of the day, warfighting concepts is the core of a nation's belief of how they fight. And that is what the Russians have strictly adhered to. Good or bad, we will analyze later. Now let's take an operational overview. Over 300 combat aircraft were moved close to the battle zone well before. The war began with 300 standoff ballistic and cruise missile strikes, which is very akin to the Western precepts of warfare. Failure of the airborne assault in contested airspace was something which initiated well before at the early stage of the battle, and which was probably a big strategic mistake. This caused significant attrition of the initial strikes, caused significant attrition of Ukraine's early warning radars and ground-controlled interceptor air defense radars, and thus S-300 long-range SAMs. This was vital because it denied the PSU aerial interception capability. In fact, it blinded the PSU greatly. And this enabled standoff targeting by air-launched PGMs of key targets and centers of gravity in the Ukrainian battle space, well inside Ukraine from Russian territory. Russia established a de facto no-fly zone over Ukraine, contrary to most initial analysis by the West. And this is according to a CIA veteran, Larry C. Johnson, who said that there is no evidence that Russia has had to curtail combat operations. This is a very interesting aspect which has come out from the from an American analyst. PSU fighters and attack helicopters did not engage the 24 to 40 mile long, depending on which narrative one read, long columns, military columns north of Kiev, which were static for a very long time, nor were they attacked by the artillery or cruise missiles. This obviously clearly indicates that the Russian airspace, while not a classic no-fly zone, had fair amount of control over the Ukrainian airspace, which prevented full-fledged operations by the PSU, and the fact that they were blinded, the absence of radars, has a huge role to play in this. Russian aircraft losses of Hepters and fighters have been primarily at low levels due to man-portable SAMs and low altitude of operations. The tempo of attack, which was initially slow, this is the air war, due to the possibility of high collateral in the earlier days. Now, this is something which runs contradictory to the Western narrative, but if one looks at it carefully, Russia has been very, very careful about collateral damage. The temporary ceasefire possibly was a masterstroke wherein it allowed the civilians to evacuate, as after that, all those who remained would be considered hostiles, and thereafter, the concern of collateral damage was no longer, would be there in their minds. VKS held back its high-value fighter assets for the big push. And the tempo built up only after the third week of operations. The Pentagon has assessed that the Russians flew more than 300 sorties a day in the last week or so, but the DoD declined to quantify the increase on the Ukrainian side. However, Ukraine has been flying as few as 5 to 10 sorties daily in contested airspace, covered in large part by Russian surface-to-air missiles. Obviously, it's a one-sided fight. Zelensky's request for Su-30 fighters by the second week did not materialize, obviously indicated that their air assets had taken losses. Due to US initiative of sending in Su-30s from Poland and Slovakia, initially refused by Slovakia and Poland, but subsequently Poland accepted to do that, but US turned it down. He has now appealed a week back to the US Congress to help secure S-300 systems from the East European nations, obviously indicating that the Russian Air Force is playing a dominant role in the Ukrainian airspace. While visiting Slovakia on March 17, Defense Secretary Lloyd secured a willingness to transfer S-300s, but the following day, Bulgaria's Prime Minister emphatically refused to transfer its systems or any other lethal defense assistance to Ukraine. Due to the flooding of Western manpads, VKS has changed its tactics. From low level, it has pushed its combat and its attacks to high level or medium altitudes outside the threat envelope. It has launched airstrikes multiple times on Ukraine from outside Ukrainian airspace, including cruise missiles from long-range bombers on vital targets. Other Russian aircraft venture into Ukrainian airspace only for short periods. Russia has established air superiority and said that if Ukraine did not receive additional military aid, Russia's advantage could develop into air dominance. This is as assessed by the US lawmakers in a recent letter to President Biden. Significant claims and counterclaims of combat aircraft downing by both sides, and this is nothing new. It will continue to increase in numbers as the war wages on. Russians have said to have lost 77 aircraft, but US closer studies seem to reveal that about 12 odd aircraft of big stripes have been lost. Most of the VKS losses have been essentially Su-25 ground attack fighters and the older generation helicopters with outdated self-protection systems. And modern fighters and the Kamov 25 attack helicopters continue in attacks. The Kamov 25 has been especially effective in night operations. Other weapon systems that initially were largely missing from the war have surfaced broadly, including the Russian drones. They've been very effective in locating static targets and following mobile launchers, which have been using Ukrainian launchers, which have been using shoot and scoot tactics. And there's a very nice video which is there where a drone has locked on to this missile launcher after it has launched its missile and follows it all the way back to apparently a mall. And then that mall is struck subsequently by standoff weapons. Very, very effective. They have switched to dumb bombs for area targets in a benign air defense environment and standoff in hostile air defense airspaces. Obviously, they're preserving precision weapons for quality targets. VKS strategy of delaying air offensive has paid off as PSU's The Battle of Britain moment is nearing an end due to the accumulated combat aircraft and skilled aircrew losses, combat fatigue, shortage of aerial weapons, fuel, spares as the war wages on. In the final analysis, my point of view is that despite its changed outlook towards air power, Russian military doctrine still doesn't require the VAs to control large swaths of airspace to pursue their war aims. VKS remains an extension of the Russian army like the earlier days, and despite the independence of the VKS remains an airborne artillery which flies in and out of battle spaces which are controlled for very limited periods. This is an assessment by David Axe of the Forbes magazine. And finally, but despite the losses, Russia will prevail, or the VKS will prevail over the PSU due to greater combat persistence and combat bench strength. Finally, controlling the skies has proved its salience in combat and conventional warfare. So what are the lessons for India? The war lessons are the centrality of control of air to military strategy. I mentioned this again. It has now come out loud and clear that any future air operation, any future military operations will mandate a requirement of controlling of the airspace, if not owning it. But given that our adversaries have strong air forces, this will be a very contested affair, and favorable air situations is something which we will have to combat, snatch, and ensure to permit full and free surface operations. There's been a poor coordination between the army and the air force, and despite the various units being under local Russian theater commander, this is something which we will emerge with greater amount of study on the situation on how effective this has been from a theater command perspective. There are definite lessons for us. Lack of AD integration between the two services, that means air defense of the army and the air defense of the Russian of the VKS. There has been a huge lack of communication and coordination. Airborne assault in contested airspaces are not operationally viable, proven loud and clear, can only be done in benign airspaces where there is no air defense threat. There's a vital role of Air Force in high-value targeting for strategic outcomes. If you notice, this is something what's done in 71 war, where we carried out strategic targeting of deep inside Pakistan on the Karachi and the Sui Karachi oil tanks and the Sui gas plant, which actually led to a shortage of fuel as the war broke on and had strategic outcomes. But unfortunately, since we haven't fought a war and there has been no strategic role of air power in Kargil, this is something which is sort of slipped from the mind of a military, from a strategic community and from the military establishment. This is something we must remember in future operations and especially in combat conventional operations. ISR remains an imperative for effective targeting. Tactical ISR through drones and fighters over challenged and contested airspace is something which will be very, very difficult. Space-based ISR is definitely a necessity for persistent stare over battle spaces. Importance of integrated air defense system amply brought out, and as I covered, the ability of the Indian Air Force's extended integrated air defense system to project offensive air defense capabilities and offensive counter-air capabilities will play a vital role in all military operations. Drones operations and loiter weapon operations which have taken place in Ukraine are only viable in benign air defense environment. And considering adversaries like we have, this is something which we will do well to bear in mind. Night operations are vital, especially in hostile and contested airspaces, which the TBA the tactical battle areas or the battle spaces which the army will be operating on. So night operations will be critical in these spaces. There are certain structural lessons also which come out. The efficacy of a theater command in a dynamic conventional war, important lessons will emerge for us. This is something we will need to study in greater depth. Each service fights differently world over. This is a truism, and it has been amply clear in this conflict. Command of other service assets has always proved a challenge historically, wherever all the services have come together to fight a war. This is an important lesson for us. Whereas joint planning and close coordination, however, has almost always been much, much more successful. Air power provides invaluable capability to deterrence and coercive deterrence. It must be included in all security planning in the future, especially in the Indian context. Extent of use will, however, depend on higher directions and overall strategy and military strategy, war strategy and military strategy, but cannot be left out on issues and situations concerning national security anymore. Service-specific domain centricity which we have had in the past must give way to a multi-domain, multi-service joint approach. This is something we will do well to imbibe in our military strategy and national security outlook. Airpower's strategic capabilities over and above its joint warfare requirements need to be recognized and leveraged both in peace and war. That means capabilities of engaging high-value target systems well inside the adversarial depths, strategic industries, centers of gravity, power centers. These will need higher military directions, and these will play a very important role in any major conventional outcome. Finally, air power is a versatile and strategic instrument of national power, which brings a variety of hard and soft power options to the table. A robust air power capability will therefore be increasingly important in a multi-domain asymmetry in India's conventional security matrix. However, leaving air power today is out of the narrative simply because it does not physically occupy a geographical domain will be a fatalis vitium or a fatal mistake from India's current and future national security interests. I will leave you with certain quotes, few quotes of the national leadership, which is as recent as 218 and will give a clue of how our political leadership thinks today. Promote a democratic, rules-based international order in which all nations, small and large, thrive as equal and sovereign. We will work with others to keep our seas, space, and airways free and open. We should have equal access as a right under international law to the use of common spaces on sea and in the air by none other than the PM Narendra Modi in the keynote address at Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I've finished my talk, and if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them on.
Spasiba. Thanks, Marshal Choudhury. You have given a very, very comprehensive air power picture. And in fact, I will request you, once the thing gets clearer, do forward us your comment vis-a-vis the theatre command concept. And I will request Vinit ji take this matter to the concerned authority, because that's what we are looking at it. Because this is a real scenario which is evolving, emerging in front of our eyes, and lessons worth learning, worth imbibing. With that, once again, spasiba. Thank you. Spasiba is in Russian. Thank you. I take a few questions. Dharamveer ji, as usual, has thrown missiles of questions in front, but I will take one or two. He's asking first is China's hypersonic capability missiles. Will it impact Air Force? Sure.
Okay. One aspect on this theatre command, I can only offer my comments, and which at best is a topic which was well out of my pay grade when I was in the service, and having retired, it only remains my opinion at this point. But on the issue of hypersonic weapons by China, they were used interestingly in Ukraine by the Russians. It's a very interesting aspect. The fact that the missile travels at hypersonic speeds makes it almost impossible to engage from an air defense perspective. However, in the near future, I'm sure there will be defense systems, and once the BMD comes in, this will be able to engage this. But it's a very potent weapon. But one factor here is that a strategic community gets very carried away by new age weapon systems. Hypersonic missiles are phenomenally expensive. So the fact here comes is that where is this missile used? In my perception, unless you use it against an extremely high value target system where it will be effective, otherwise it will be a lot of weapons which was used in Gulf War, high value precision target weapons, and which the Americans had a very interesting quote where they said $1 billion platform firing $1 million weapon to engage a $10 tent. So that means your target system has to be extremely valuable, and obviously missiles like this, which are very expensive, will not be held in large numbers, but will have to be used judiciously. But will most certainly have a strategic implication in warfare in the future.
And another aspect he's asking, in fact, he's asking Air Force whether Air Force can take two front war simultaneously, Pakistan and China air war, capability wise.
This is something. There were a lot of speculation and discussion and sort of airing of views on this. The fact of it is, it is an extremely difficult proposition. But do remember that militaries fight against odds, and this has been amply clear in this recent Russo-Ukrainian war. So, with push comes to shove, the Indian Air Force and Airpower will most certainly do its best to fight across in a coercive scenario, I beg your pardon, in a two-front scenario. But here I would like to make a few clarifications. From my perspective, I wouldn't like to call it a two-front scenario. I will say a two-adversary scenario, because fronts could be many. You could as well have 3-4 fronts on the west and in the north and in the east. But important aspect to remember here is that China and the Pakistan, especially the air forces, have been training together for many years now. They have gone through a series of 8 joint exercises till now called Shaheen, in which the PLAF exercises with the PAF. Very interestingly, in 2019, if I'm not wrong, Zhu Qilang, who is the CMC member, the chairman, CMC Central Military Commission member, one of the 6 permanent members, and who's been an ex-air chief and held this post for 3 years, is de facto the military number 2 after Xi Jinping. He visited China and sort of had discussions with their military leadership, has given Pakistan access to their space-based imagery of certain areas in the north, and apparently has convinced the military leadership to let PF play a leading role in any operation. Why is this? Most certainly, when the spin-up took place in fact, post Galwan, in fact, when the earlier confrontations which we have had air power spinning up very quickly. And post Galwan, in fact, Indian Air Force spun up. Indian Air Force learned a lot of lessons in Kargil conflict in high altitude warfare, and has a fairly potent capability. And the rate at which the Indian Air Force spun up and moved its forces is something which is what I talked about, an asymmetric advantage which we had. Basically, because our air bases and our platforms operate from low altitude bases, and low altitude ceilings can carry higher weapons and have standoff capabilities, unlike the PLAF. So PLAF knows that this is a weakness there, and hence for them, PLAF to collude with the PAF is a very, very high possibility in the future. But a two adversary war is, a lot of specialists and analysts think it's unthinkable, but it cannot be ruled out from the playboard of the Indian military establishment.
I will take the last question, but before that, there are 2 questions, one from Abhay Wade and one from Piyush Saxena. Both are not actually falling in the realm of this discussion. Abhay Wade says that why we never raised the question when 1965 and other wars, the Air Force was not allowed. And Piyush Saxena, where is Russo-Ukraine war is heading? These are all speculation, and one is the inquiry sort of thing. Will not debate that. And I take the last question of the evening from Soumyajit Das. Going into the future, should India invest in developing air superiority omni-role fighter or AD or cruise missiles? Capability-wise, air superiority omni-role fighter. I don't know. Maybe Amka.
Okay, some quick answers. Lessons of the war are not public because officially the history has not been declassified. Though the MOD has brought it out as an unofficial history of all the wars, in fact, which they are available with the MOD. They are available reference, but obviously cannot be quoted authentically since they are not an accepted official history. But these facts are all available today in the realm. Russo-Ukraine war, I think the end state is pretty clear. Though I must quickly say that there is very interesting on the lighter vein. There is I think a Jyotishi who has said that if the war doesn't finish by the 27th of this month, it will carry on for years. So I will leave it at that. But the outcome of the war is pretty clear. In fact, especially the air war, and it has, I think, run its course. Now, coming to the last part of the question on, yes, multi-role fighters are the flavor today. In fact, multi-role 5th generation fighters are something which we are looking at it.